we become the story, and I hate that.
Yeah.
I just can't stand becoming the story.
That's a great way to start. What do you mean? Let's get into
working
it.
at the ABC is like an entire personality. 'Cause
Let's
it's
get
not
into
you,
it.
It's its own like
it's its own ecosystem.
microcosm.
Yeah.
Do you mean like when you do a story, you become the face of the story? Is
No.
okay?
It's like when people start talking, like, what's Jeremy Fernandez's, background story?
Yeah.
Who's his partner? Like, what, who's his daughter? Like,
I have
Right.
had people
What's wrong
ask me,
with-
it's like, is he single? And I'm like, no.
No, but I don't put any of either of
Yeah.
them on socials.
Yeah.
And then also, like, the bus incident was I
Mm-hmm.
got abused on a bus years ago, which I hate talking about because I didn't realise, I didn't understand my profile at the time. And so I just I put it on social media. I was like, I'm just Jeremy Fernandez. Like, oh, who cares?
Yeah.
And then it turned into this thing. It was like on the front page of the SMH. And I was like, whoa, what? I was on the project. I was like, oh, this is not quite.
You're famous.
I didn't realise that, since then, it was a real lesson in I need to watch my tongue
Right.
and be very careful about how I express things, what I talk about publicly,
Mm.
because it carries a lot more weight than even I realised.
And then it's layered by working at the ABC.
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
magnified by if you worked anywhere else
Yes.
even,
Yes,
which is like a chokehold.
that's right.
Yeah.
Sorry, anyway.
That's okay.
Yabba, yabba, yabba.
Welcome to SBS Spice.
Thank you
Thank
for
you so
having
much for
us.
being here. So listeners, I've got Mridula Amin, a photojournalist, which is such a niche and has really shaped my perspective of journalism. So very excited to talk to you. And we've got Jeremy Fernandez from the ABC. Jeremy and I have been yapping for about 25 minutes. So,
Have we got anything left to talk about?
heaps. That was just scratching the surface. So thank you so much for coming in and joining me on SBS Spice. This is a podcast we started 2 years now. And listeners, the Australian Audio Awards was last evening, so thank you. We didn't win, but you know what? They're lost. So yeah, I'm a little bit bitter about it. But
But nominated, what a great thing to
I'm
even
kidding.
be in,
No,
in
yes.
good company, right?
Yes.
That's really important.
It was a great night. Really nice to see fellow journalists. So this chat is really very well timed because we spend our entire evening talking to storytellers, talking to podcasters, getting to know how people do their work. So we'll get a little bit more into it with Mridula and Jeremy today. Mridula, I'm going to start off with you.
Oh, great.
Yeah, good luck.
It's a test.
Yeah. The first time that I saw photos in a newspaper, I would stare at them for a very long time. I would just imagine how the person took it, what was going on in their mind. And, there've been some photos that have really shaped how we look at the world. When did you start thinking about yourself as a photojournalist, the niche of taking photos for a story?
I think it took me a really long time to even own like photojournalism as a term. Like I didn't used to call myself a photojournalist. And to be honest, I didn't really plan to be in this career. Like I ended up, doing a law and media degree. I was an admitted lawyer and, now obviously I'm somewhere else. But I would say peeling it back when I was in high school, I was going through like magazines. One was called Colours. I was, researching and there was photojournalists of the time, like Tim Hetherington, he was doing like a series in Afghanistan of like just soldiers, but it wasn't the typical war photography. He was taking these kind of images of sleeping like male soldiers. And so there was this like tenderness to his work. And I think that's the first time I was drawn into this sort of moodscape and, was getting an understanding of things. And, in magazines, it's, I grew up in Newcastle. I guess those pictures are a way for me to travel and get excited. But it definitely wasn't like a viable career. I wasn't like, I'm going to go be a photojournalist. But then I was working at a law firm as a clerk, I think, maybe in my final few years of law school. And then all I would do at work is sort of like Google these images and look up these photojournalists, and then I figured out what camera Tim Hetherington and Steve McCurry would use, and I ended up using my life savings to buy this like Canon camera. And at the time in university, we were studying the Rohingya crisis, and I found, there was obviously limits to law, and I had come across the work of a Getty Images photographer called Jonas Gratzer, and I just emailed him. I was like, I love your photos. Like, how did you get access? And then he just sent me this contact. He's like, yeah, if you want to go, here it is. This guy will help you. And I just went with it. And I took this camera I didn't use. I, paid for myself to get over there. And it turned out the contact he'd given me was someone who was could forge, who was on the inside, who was already a internally displaced Rohingya person, who was going to forge my papers to get into this IDPK. And so when I came
Wow.
back from that trip, obviously, like, I wasn't calling myself a photojournalist, but I had the experience of that photojournalism, and I was like, it just hit me. I was like, this is my groove. This is my life's work. When you
Yeah.
get that feeling, when I came back to the law firm, I was like, oh my God, this isn't it. Like, it's
Yeah.
somewhere here. But it took me probably a few years after that to really own the term photojournalist.
Yeah, right. What
just
about
doing
you,
this stuff.
Jeremy?
I've had this exact discussion with other people before about the power of the still image.
Yes.
I love portraiture. I love photographs. And I've spoken to people who've asked me what I find so engaging about video. And I think, actually, do you know what I love? The still image. Because I find the same thing. I wonder, what happened to that person? What happened right before this photo was taken? What happened immediately after?
Yeah.
We don't know. And, a video has almost a beginning, middle, and an end.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I find portraiture, photography, it is the middle. And the story of what happens after and before is entirely open. And I think what that invites of the imagination is absolutely fascinating.
I completely agree. Well, when did you first start calling yourself a journalist? Did it take you years too?
Yeah. I mean, there's a real kind of imposter syndrome, I think. For me, I'll speak for myself.
Yeah.
I kind of fell into it, right? So my
Right.
father was a newspaper journalist, and I swore black and blue that I would not become a journalist because it's such an adversarial industry to be in. You're constantly fighting with people who want their say, who, are spreading misinformation or whatever, people in power, you're constantly coming up against it. And I thought, I'm a fairly peace-loving kind of person. This is not the life for me. What really engaged me was the joy of working in a group of people. It has to be, by nature, particularly television and radio, so collaborative. And I really enjoyed being part of a team, and I almost didn't care what role I played in it. And from a young age, I was told that I don't look like the archetypal person, I don't sound like the archetypal person that anyone wants to see on Australian broadcast media or to hear on Australian broadcast media. So very early in my career, before my career really even started, I thought it would be nice to be on air. I'd like to experience the full spectrum of the industry, but I'm probably never going to make it. But I love it so much, and I love the storytelling. You get this all-access pass when you're a journalist
Yeah.
to meet people who know things that we don't know.
Yeah.
And so to understand human resilience, to understand love, to understand persistence, connection through the eyes of other people, I think that is the greatest all-access pass you can get in life.
Yeah.
And so that's what engaged me with the industry. And then all the on-air stuff kind of happened by accident over time, over a long period of time. I've been a journalist now for 27 years.
Wow.
And so it hasn't happened particularly deliberately. It's just been a
Yeah.
very organic process of feeling things around, and someone calls in sick, can you step in here and fill in over here and step up over there and whatever. And then next thing you know, you're reading the nightly news.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've got no idea how it happened.
Yeah, no, I love the note about your witness to like human resilience, right?
Yes.
It's like, it's such a beautiful
Yeah.
like job to have. And I was reading on the internet the other day, I don't have a prime, I'll always evolve. And I was like, oh my God, this is so like journalism for me. Cause there's no prime really. Like
Well,
you're
maybe
always,
in TV.
well,
Television's very
that's a podcast
volatile.
on ageism.
That's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation. But I think just mentally, there's always a story that's surprising me, always a person that I'm intrigued by. Like I'm obviously like so very new to this in scheme of things, but so far I've never really gone, yeah, I know everything about this. And I think that's kind of what, gives me the most joy, because you never really know it fully. And that's where, the job comes in.
And the old adage about getting older and knowing less,
Yes.
it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Certainly for me.
Yes.
I think, I thought I knew everything at 15. And then at 21, I started maybe thinking, maybe not.
Maybe not.
And now at my age, absolutely not.
Yeah.
There is so much more to know and to learn and to enjoy.
100%. Mridula, has there been a photo that you were hesitant to take?
In anything that I've been hesitant or I don't think I should take the photo, I don't take the photo, actually. And so, even when Jeremy and I used to work at the ABC together. We'd covered bushfires together. You know, there always needs to be that moment of eye contact or some sort of permission. And like, you know, it's not an exact science and I can't really explain, like, is it consent, is it not? But there needs to be an acknowledgement that I'm going to take your picture in this very hard time. Some other photojournalists, you know, you can take the picture first and have the conversation later. I do try and have that moment so I feel even assured, so I don't feel guilty later or like a complete crow. But obviously situations happen where I take it. But hesitant to take a picture, yes. I think when people are in immense grief, like outside a house that's completely collapsed and I don't know if they'd be comfortable with it, I've hesitated, but usually I've had an interaction that says it's okay or not.
So there might have been times that you might have been hesitant to take a photo, but you know how much it would mean to a reader or it would, you know, add to the legacy of whatever's happening at the moment. Does the journalist sort of kick in and the photojournalist takes a backseat, or?
I think I work through it. I mean, obviously, you go into a journalism mode and you're having kind of a dialogue with whoever you're taking the picture of or the scene. Like, you know, sometimes it's also like the information. You can't take a crop photo and then have not this information out. So definitely, you just take the photo, and if it's very important for the story, obviously I know that, knowing the story really deeply. But for example, sometimes when I was in Nauru taking pictures, that's difficult because I was photographing children who are going through suicidal tendencies and with their parents.
Yeah.
And there would be images that, you know, the child is being like held up potentially by a family member. That can become complex. And I know that because I know the full gambit of, okay, when this goes to publish, are we going to get questions about, you know, is a child being raised up for a photo?
Right.
So those things come in mind, but then I can kind of work through those issues on the ground, both as a photojournalist and a journalist, and be like, okay, let's get portraits more, everyone's at the same level, or, you know, make sure I'm getting permission forms and different things like that.
Yeah. I mean, with photos or videos, sometimes, you know, I mean, Gaza comes to mind, and that's my only access, right? Images or videos. I wouldn't ever know what's happening if someone wasn't taking photos, if someone wasn't talking about the story. Jeremy, in your career of 27 years now, what has been a story that was difficult for you to do, but you kind of came out of it proud that you did the story?
Oh gosh, there have been so many.
Yeah, I'm sure.
One of them was covering the Sexual Abuse Royal Commission. That was a lot.
Yeah.
I know people who've been sexually assaulted personally and professionally. I was inviting people to speak on air about some really difficult experiences.
Yeah.
I know audiences broadly find a lot of this information a bit too much to process. There is a real fatigue with hearing stories of other people's suffering, what they've endured.
Yeah.
And yet it's so important to get it out there, to put it on the record.
Absolutely.
There was a particular press conference with someone who was accused of having overlooked sexual abuse, possibly committed some sexual abuse. I was broadcasting that day and I found it incredibly difficult. I called there was a woman I called. It was before I was due to interview her on air. She had agreed to come on to the ABC News channel to speak about her experience and her observations about the Royal Commission and what it was hoped to achieve at the time. And I wanted to, it's the consent thing again, right, which I think I've refined over time. I kind of look back on my younger years and think, wow, I was quite indelicate as a young journalist, and I think I'm more considerate now of the people I put to air, and I hope to not put them in a position where they have regret about telling their story with me as the facilitator.
Yeah.
But I called this woman right before the show and I said, look, I want you to know that I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
As a journalist, I'm so sorry for what you've been through and I'm so grateful that you're talking to me. This is what I want to cover. And then I started tearing up, and it still gives me shivers talking about it.
Yeah,
now
you've given me goosebumps.
I just didn't know how to say to her,
Yeah.
I want the media to have a role in making this up to you, in giving you the platform to say what you want to say, and to also tell the story about your endurance. This is not a story about just your suffering. It's about how you've endured. You moved on. You got the help. You got the therapy. You have possibly prevented other people from going through the same thing. You've been there for people who needed someone to lean on because they've been through similar experiences. And so I try to, in those moments when you're telling, a story of misery and sadness, try to look for those sparks of where people watching, people who've endured a similar thing, can kind of hook on to a sense of hope about this person's endurance, their resilience, their persistence, while retaining the power of their own story. I don't think of myself as a storyteller, and I get really irritated when journalists talk about themselves as storytellers. We are here just directing traffic and facilitating other people telling their stories. And as much as possible, even when I'm scripting for TV, I think less Jeremy, more of the people we're interviewing.
Yeah.
And so I strip myself out of my own programs as much as possible, because
and it seems
we
like
are
a conscious
here.
choice.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. You reminded me of this journalist that I deeply admire. She's, like in her 60s now. And whenever I ask her about something that she has regretted, she tells me when she was 21, there was a grieving mother and her sons were in the hospital and she was just sent to, grab a bite from her. And she always tells me how it ended before she tells me what happened. And she was like, she screamed at me. And I was like, oh my God, what did you ask? And she was like, I was so silly. I was 21. I was so eager to do the story that I went up to this grieving mother and I said, how are you feeling? Do you think what happened to your son was okay? And she always tells me that I'll never forget her eyes. She looked at me and she just started screaming at me that, what do you mean how I'm feeling? What do you mean what happened was okay? And she was like, that's the day I learned if I don't have a good enough question, I should just maybe listen, think of the question in my mind, and then deliver it. Because sometimes we're so eager to do the stories, we forget the person in front of us. Yeah. We forget what they are going through. And we also forget who'll be listening, who'll be watching. And I think internet might be a very messy thing to have happened to us, although I love it. One thing that it did do is, instant intent and instant delivery is available. So when I watch stories, I'm constantly like, why would you ask that? Or why did you not ask that? And Mridula, I'm curious, other than just consent, are there questions you ask your subjects before capturing them? And what are they?
So I think, it's not this, equal science. Like even like sometimes it's like, oh, how are you feeling? I use a lot of humor. I break the ice first.
Disarm
obviously.
them,
Yeah, you disarm them. But really for photojournalism, the way that I work, I want to know everything about a person because we are in this role, which is so intimate. And I do ask them, what do you do with your day? Like we obviously talk about the story at hand. Say I was doing a story about a caravan park. Obviously that one I worked on for 4 months, but I would just go around and be like, what do you do? Like, how did you get here? But some of those are actually quite deep questions to ask, like, how did you get here? And so you almost need to have like tea, coffee chats. And then I'm just like, what do you do with your day and your night? Like I kind of want to be a fly on the wall. For example, with one of people I photographed, Andrew, he was like this really big football fan, and he'd come to the park like 12 years ago and he was 49, and then he was like, I wake up at 4 a.m. and I collect like junk metal. Like I go around doing that. And I was like, great, like that's such an interesting visual scene. In my head as a journalist, I was like, but you get the pension, so why are you doing that? Like that's really hard work for like someone pushing 70. And it turned out like later, like a month later, he told me he had a secret son. And then like the month after that, he's like, oh, that's my dream. I'm going to like make this extra money, and I don't want maybe like, the government to fully find out, but I want to be reunited with my young son. But I live in a caravan park.
Wow.
So, like you have to, the full story will reveal itself with time, and you don't always have the luxury of time. I was obviously working like my daily job, but I obviously had that story going. But yeah, I try and break the ice with humor. I definitely try and read the person, what kind of person they are. But I'm also trying to be authentic too. I'm not trying to ask a question exactly to charm. I'm trying to build trust. And I will tell someone, like, I do fair stories. Like the people in that particular story, some of them were heroin addicts. And I was like, I am going to discuss that. Are you okay with that? But I will be fair. Yeah. But I'm not trying to tell them, like, I'm going to be your best friend and the story's going to be all just like, great. I'm just like, I'm going to tell the story.
Yeah.
So, and I think people really respond to that because you're not trying to charm them or lead in. It's like, I'm really trying to tell this story, this reality. And And so I never try and hide that I'm a journo. Every time I walk up, I've obviously got a camera in hand. I say, I'm a journalist. Sometimes I don't even know where the story is heading, but this is my rough idea. Do you want to talk?
I keep coming back to you saying you don't like the word storytellers.
Yeah, what's that about?
I
I don't agree.
Well, I just sort of feel like, each to their
Because you really are telling someone's story, especially with your
I
work.
guess for me, it's about whose story is it?
Yes.
And do I
The
consider
agents,
myself
yeah.
the teller of someone else's story? And that's where
Understood.
it kind of jars for me. I kind of don't
Understood.
consider myself the story,
Yeah.
the teller of someone else's story. I want to facilitate them telling their own story, but I need to kind of make it work in the media, right? In the medium that we're working in, it needs to kind of work in a certain order, and so I need to be able to string things together.
Yeah.
I would be a storyteller if I was talking about myself.
Yeah.
Because it's my story. But I kind of find there's a bit of presumption involved in being the conduit of someone else's experience and story and what they've been through in life. So
Do you think it's ego? Because a lot of the times when, I have met journalists and I really want to puncture their pomposity a lot of the times.
yes, same.
Because I think they become like, I'm telling the story. So
Yeah.
I understand
It's
where
been
you're
main
coming
character
from.
syndrome. Right? Like
Particularly in TV, like I would have to do TV, and it's like people are like, I need to be in most of the story. I'm the teller. The audience is
Yeah.
following me, and it's just like
It's about-
actually without you, I'd still probably cry. Like I don't know.
But true. I would agree with that.
But what Jeremy, I feel like that is the TV that stands out where that conscious decision is being made, because you do
Yeah.
find a lot of journalists are like, the job is me presenting, the job is me being here and witnessing and being the face of this. But
And can I
that's
tell
not
you,
it.
the presenting, which I do,
Yeah.
most days in the week, is about 5% of the job.
Yes.
And so there's this real kind of diversion in what people understand my job is, because they only really ever see me on TV or
Yeah.
hear me on the radio or whatever. Whereas that's 5% of my day, and most of it is actually the writing, the researching,
Yep.
the reading that's involved.
Yeah.
And so, like, even now I'll have friends go, what time are you showing up in the studio? Like 15 minutes before you go on air. And I'm like, how do you think this comes together? Like, what?
How do you think this works?
I can just roll up in a suit and just,
I'd love
I'm here
that.
to tell stories.
So how do you think of your questions then? If you like to remove yourself as much as you can from the story, but help facilitate.
Yes.
What is Jeremy's sort of mental prep? How do you form your questions? I think that's kind of like my favorite thing about this profession is how you ask a question and what is it that you're asking. And it's so different for everyone.
Yes.
So
And
how do you prep your questions?
And so much of the time, I'm doing stories about things I know very little about.
Yes.
Like, someone says, right, we're going to do a special on energy policy. And I go, barely. Like, I just, like what hours and I just don't understand how this stuff works, but I have to read. I read and I read and I read. It's my first cure to understanding, to getting into a story and to interviewing someone is to read like crazy.
Yeah.
To be able to get my head around what the story is, what the key points are,
Yeah.
and how I need to communicate that to a lay audience, which is what I'm broadcasting to. It's not a business-to-business kind of proposition. I'm broadcasting to a lay audience. So what do I need to know? What are the, so identifying what the top lines of the story are and what it is that people need to know and what people understand. I also think I've developed with time and maturity in the role a clearer understanding of what the person I'm interviewing owes the audience, owes the public, owes the office. And a thing I explain to people is that, for example, interviewing a survivor of sexual abuse, that it's not an interrogation. It's not like I'm interviewing the Prime Minister who holds an office and who is accountable to the people. A sexual abuse survivor, or someone who's had a car accident, or someone whose house is burnt down, or someone who's celebrating their 90th wedding anniversary, doesn't have that same accountability to the audience. So I think I have a clearer idea in my head now about, sure, I'm going to ask questions, but what is it that this person actually owes the audience, owes the public? And that helps then narrow the frame of what this interview is actually about, and then kind of going from there.
What about the demeanor? we've talked about the prep, we've talked about the questions. What about the demeanor and the body language? Do you know, how do you want to come across?
For myself,
Yes.
I think I'm going to take this to a lighter tone. The
Sure.
number of people who've said to me, "You need to dress more like Lillian Chin," because like she's fabulous and
Not
just
you dropping her
great
name at
outfits.
SBS.
Like,
Yeah,
no, but like
What a
this is
fashionista.
literally this is a conversation I've had dozens of times, right? And my approach is like we love Lillian, of course.
Yes.
But like if I dressed like her, no one would hear what I was saying. Do you know what I mean? So I take a view that
I don't know what you mean. I think you rock it. I actually don't know what you mean. Sorry.
Hanging out with you all the time.
Yeah.
like I can't like you can't copy the original, right? But I take a view of being very like neat, tidy, and unremarkable in my appearance is what I try to be. So
you think that's also part of your body language, like
It's
how you
my-
dress and how you...
How I dress is
Yeah.
try to be as neutral looking as possible. I don't mean that in a partisan kind of way,
No,
but
no, I understand.
as undistracting as possible.
I understand.
Nice tie, nice suit, nice shirt.
Yeah.
Not like a speck of coffee there,
Yeah.
or like Vegemite smear over here, or whatever.
Yeah.
Just neat, tidy, and unremarkable in many ways is what I try to be.
Yeah.
So that I'm
Mm-hmm.
not distracting. I'm not the
Mm.
story. I'm not the point of conversation.
That brings me to talking about the Australian journalism landscape as a whole. Do you think it has changed over the years? And how?
Yeah, I mean, it is.
Look,
Yes.
I'm the elder person in the room. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, as people of colour
Yeah.
in working in the media, I remember a time
Hmm.
when I was told specifically I wouldn't make it in broadcast because I sound...
You were
I-
told that?
I was many times. You
Wow.
know, the way, you know, someone said to me once, someone pulled me up and said, "We've had a few complaints about how you say Pakistan because it's not the standard Australian English way."
It's Pakistan?
Pakistan.
It's Pakistan.
Pakistan. She like, and she gave me a few more examples, and I said, "Do you know what? Fine. I'm not so desperate to be on air
Yeah.
that I'm going to bring my organisation into disrepute.
Mm-hmm.
Take me off air." I said, "I know I'm right, and I know it's certainly not Pakistan."
It's not. It's Pakistan.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's stuff like that, and so
When I first heard Nepal, I was like, who's Paul?
it's stuff
I
like
was
that,
so
right?
confused. I was like, it's Nepal.
Yeah.
Like Iraq
Yeah.
and, you know, like...
yeah, all that sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
look, and there is, you know, kind of, I do make some allowances. Like Nepal is one of those ones. I go Nepal, you know, what I pronounce it a whole bunch of ways. And
Right.
it almost changes according with the audience and what I remember to say at the time. I don't demand perfection, but I have seen the change over time.
Because that would not fly today. And
No,
I don't
yeah.
I don't mean it in the way that has changed.
Yes.
I mean it like they won't say it now.
Yes.
They won't say it to your
100%.
face now,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that
I think my
Things have
my age
changed.
group was like the crux. So I remember getting the voice training, and yes, like, you know, pronounce it like this. And I think I was the last generation where people would actually tell you, like, oh, you know, you're saying it a bit ethnic. Whereas now, like, you wouldn't have that conversation.
No.
And so it's much more like subversive and insidious to know sometimes like why you might not
That's
get on
right.
there, because it just creates problems in contracts and everything else. But sometimes I even like appreciated the back in the day, because I was like, oh, that's what you're thinking.
they'll
That's-
say it to
that's
your
how
face.
It is. Yeah.
I agree. I think it's insidious is a good word, because now it's like it's become microaggressions, and it's become like, you know, harder to deal with. I think when I was in India or when I was younger, people would just say it and they were like, oh, clocked it. That's how you see me. That's what you mean. At least I know how to navigate the situation, or at least I know how to talk to you. But now I think political correctness has reached a level in which like people won't actually tell you anything. So then you become very, you know, you're working in your silos.
I would agree with that. But just remember, there was a time, and I was part of that time, where the door was shut.
Yeah.
You would not have a microphone in front of 3 brown people right now. It
Yeah.
just would not happen, let alone have it go to air anywhere. It just would not happen. So I think being in the room at least,
Yeah.
as insidious as it is, and I sort of agree with aspects of that, at least we've got microphones in front of us.
At least that's
now.
happened.
You know what?
For sure.
Yeah. So
For sure.
is it imperfect? Yes.
Yeah.
Has it changed? Yes.
Yeah.
Is there more to go? Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, my co-host and I talk about it all the time whenever we look at Spice. You know, sometimes on the weekends we just look at our feed and we're like, wow, look at the range of people we have spoken to. Look at the brown actors, creatives, rappers. Like, you know, sometimes people are like, rapper from India? And I was like, yes, it's a great rap scene in India. I don't know where you've been. So it's been so lovely talking to South Asians in general. And the only common thing, and I'm really proud of that, within our guests is that they're South Asian. That's the only common thing because they're so different from each other and the conversations are so wildly different. And we love that so much because, you know, it's like, and look, am I aware that when I tell people a South Asian podcast, what keywords they are thinking of? And, you know, they think that this show is something that they would never listen to. And I'm just like, you're so wrong. Sometimes it's just rants. We're just ranting away. Sometimes we're just yapping away. This show is absolutely for you too. But like the pigeonholing, in the name of diversity, controversial take, I think there's a lot more pigeonholing rather than expansion. Because now there are like, you do this, you do this, you do this. And, you know, we think that
so
we're being
like
diverse.
You're ethnic, so you do the ethnic stuff.
That's the biggest, I think,
Yeah.
the biggest trap that I think, you know, even kind of being like, oh, I'm a South Asian journo doing a South Asian podcast. That is the risk because it's like, okay, is that all you do? But I think we've also kind of sometimes we do too much political correctness and we end up wasting time like on some of these issues. I'm like, okay, let's go back to the stories that we're trying to tell. And I have, you know, maybe I'm like mid-career now and I have these thoughts where I'm like, yeah, does it really matter? Do we really need to be having this discussion over and over and over again? Like for me, my technique was like, I want you to probably know what I think and where I stand through my stories. I don't really now want to enter meeting rooms and sit on diversity panels for like 2 hours to try to do that. But the pigeonholing is hard because I feel like sometimes you have to take on that burden too. I remember we'd as reporters, we'd have to come up with case studies and I'd always be like the one coming up with the ones, you know, the migrant ones. And I remember the trust that I had at the ABC, to be fair with my editors, I could go to them and be like, why was I the only one to bring the ethnics? And they would hear that and be like, you're absolutely right. And so it was a learning curve. But I guess you have to build trust up in an organisation to just be able to come out and be like, what the hell's that?
Yeah.
You can't do it everywhere. I definitely had that experience at the ABC, which I appreciated.
I'm glad. Look, it's that, but then it's also like, if I don't do it, then who will? So, you know, it's like, it's a tough space to navigate and it's frustrating because sometimes I think I you know, my community would tell me stories and my first question is, oh my God, is someone going to take this up? Is the mainstream media going to take this up? And if the only cost is I'm an Indian person doing the Indian story, you know what? So be it. Sometimes a story is so important and you're so acutely aware that it will not see the light of the day if you didn't do it. So, you know, there are days that you're like, damn, I'm so pigeonholed. And then there are days like, thank God that I did that story because I don't know who else would have done that.
Like some of the investigative journalists in Australia only focus on white people's stories when you look at it, but they're not having this internal minefield. I'm like, you could do a story about a white person like every single day and no one would, you know, it wouldn't be a pigeonholing.
No.
Yet somehow in reverse, it does impact and be like, oh yeah, she's really got the migrant slice of life thing. So it's just interesting because I think that is a very like colonial mindset that we even get trapped in ourselves.
Yeah. What do you think has been like the most desperate change that we really needed it and has happened?
I can't think of anything in particular.
Right.
But I part of the reason I pinch myself every day and think, okay, how did this happen? How am I in a TV studio? How am I, you know, reading this flagship bulletin for the ABC? This was sort of not meant to happen. The thing that strikes me is how incremental it's been, which is why I think, you know, as imperfect as so many of these things we're talking about are, the door finally opened. And that's never lost on me because I remember when the door was closed, there was no option of doing anything but being a silent producer to make someone else look good. That was going to be the peak of my career. And I was grateful for that because I love the industry and I love the storytelling. I love facilitating other people telling their stories.
Yeah.
The thing that strikes me is how incremental it is, how imperfect it is. It's sort of, you know, it's 5 steps forward, 4 steps back, 3 steps forward, 10 steps back,
Yeah.
20 steps forward. It's like that, and it's been like that throughout my career. And it depends on who you come up against. You know, sometimes you come up against a really good advocate, a manager who understands that your value as a person, as a participant in a team, much more broadly than the accent, the skin color, the cultural background, and would be willing to take a chance to apply you in other contexts as well.
Yeah, I think definitely I've seen that in journalism. Like, you know, so many more brown female like journalists out there. You know, photojournalism though I think is still an area that I'm like still one of the few in Australia. So it's interesting. And I don't know exactly what it is. Is it seeing more people like you to encourage people? Is it just those barriers up? I'm not totally sure.
I mean, the barriers are also within our own families, right?
Yeah.
You know, when I told my parents I want to go to the WA Academy of Performing Arts to study broadcast on Australian television, they were not happy. Like, my dad was not happy at all. Understandably, like, you know, I kind of look back now as a parent myself and think, well, it seems fanciful. And so I think, you know, we're coming up against this thing in the industry. And sometimes I think the industry is more open-armed than our own cultural
100%.
family backgrounds.
100%. The first time I told, like, I think it was my dad's friend, and we had gone for dinner, and he was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I really want to be a journalist. And he was like, and you will come home late at night? And I was like, hey, I did not think of that. Why was that your first response?
Dirty, yeah, I know.
I know.
I've heard that so many times. Like, you know, being a photojournalist, and I'm like coming home at 3 a.m. It's like, oh my God, like what will people say?
What will people
people
say?
say? And I was like, I feel like my parents didn't even. They just kept saying I was a lawyer up until, like, you know, I had like a front cover on Nat Geo, and they were finally like, look, or like, you know, someone from Bangladesh, like, you know, interviewed me for Over the Walk, and then they're like, yes, okay, now I can.
now
I was
you
like,
can
you're
tell.
toxic. But I feel like I got into journalism through, like, you know, an unpaid internship.
So
And
did
I,
I.
it's and I think those are one of the main things that have changed. I think I don't know if it's PC, and obviously, you know, people want to get paid for your work, but there's less. I do think it is a bit harder, and you have to be a bit more savvy to just like get through it. Because I didn't do any of the like cadetships. It was sort of like unpaid internship at SBS or a mentorship program, and then you do a random like a news librarian job and work away. And so I hope those openings are still there. So because I think from people from different backgrounds, they need things outside that, you know, the traditional like cadetship, or you've really gone to journalism school. Like, some people are making that switch later after doing different, you know, careers. And, you know, I hope that we can adapt to that and keep some doors open for people who aren't just coming from very traditional, I've always wanted to be a journalist background.
Yeah.
Because those people do tell some of the most interesting stories, and that's the diversity I'm really keen to see as well.
Thank you so much for joining me, Mridula and Jeremy. Thank you guys for listening. You can watch this interview on YouTube. We just launched our YouTube.
Thank you for having us.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
What
Thank
a
you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you.
so nice to catch up.
Yes.